Secretary Kerry, you're out with a terrific new book I've read, a very personal memoir called Every Day is Extra, based off of your service in Vietnam. Give us a sense of why you wrote this book. Why was this important at this particular point in time for you to write this particular book?
Well, thank you, David. I think my book is actually a roadmap for how we fix some of the problems that we face today and the antidote to where we find ourselves, because it's about being engaged in the system. It's about working with a guy like John McCain, coming together from different places, finding common ground, being able to compromise, being able to be bipartisan, and going after accountability, rule of law, making things the way citizens expect them to be. And I think there are a series of stories that I lay out in the book, which really, I hope, will encourage people to understand that we can get out of messes, that America is remarkably strong, that we have great institutions, that historically they've stood up to the test, and I believe they will now.
So one of the problems that you identify specifically is climate change in the environment, and you particularly are near and dear to the ocean for reasons that you explain in the book, going back into your childhood. But I want to read a short passage of what you said about climate change. You said, in part, the current president of the United States has eagerly assumed the role of cheerleader in chief for capricious choices that will cost lives and treasure. What is the ordinary citizen to do about that?
Vote. I mean, the most important single thing that citizens can do is be part of the political process, be part of the debate, help to organize, support a candidate, become engaged. In the last election, when our current president, whose policies on climate change are dangerous, when he was elected, we saw 54.2% of eligible Americans come out to vote. That's to be compared to Barack Obama in 2008. It was 62.3% of Americans who came out to vote. So that difference is the difference in an election. I mean, the real story of 2016 is not who turned out. The real story is who didn't turn out. And I think that the best thing Americans can do is live citizenship, be engaged in making our democracy work more effectively, hold public people accountable.
Elections have consequences, as you have said. One of the consequences of President Trump being in office is to really, apparently at least, undo an agreement that you worked long and hard on, and that's the Iran nuclear deal, specifically. What is your hope that, in fact, we can get back to the table and get to a deal with Iran again?
Well, there will be no negotiation, in my judgment, between Iran and the United States while President Trump is president, because he has proven himself to be unwilling to live up to a deal. And so no Iranian leader could survive by coming to the table, because it would look like capitulation. It would look like they've been bullied into it. And you can imagine in our country, whether any politician would survive if it appeared to be weak, or that person. So I just don't think there's going to be a negotiation in the near term. It's questionable whether there will be one in the long term, but I suspect there are ways to get there and have a reasonable thing. What President Trump has done with respect to the Iran agreement is really to alienate the people who came to the agreement with us. France, Germany, Britain, Russia, China, they're all staying in the agreement. And Iran is, staying in the agreement. So only President Trump has pulled out, and he hasn't achieved any of the goals that he wants to achieve with respect to that. And now many people believe he's pursuing a policy of regime change. Well, history has taught us that we don't do regime change very well. Moreover, the likelihood of a change in Iran will produce somebody far more like Ahmadinejad, or a hardliner, than it will some kind of Jeffersonian Democrat. So I think he's lost leverage. I think he's actually put us in an isolated position. He's farmed out American foreign policy to other countries who now could have a greater impact on what happens in the Middle East than we do. And I think it's very unfortunate. So, and by the way, the deal is the strongest. It is the strongest nuclear deal on the planet today. And it gave us unprecedented insight to Iran's program and left us in an extremely strong position to, all of us, enforce the Non-Proliferation Treaty.
So, Mr. Secretary, you've said that from time to time you actually talk a little bit with your former counterpart, the foreign minister of Iran, as you do, as I understand, with other foreign ministers whom you've known, Mr. Zarif. From your talks with him, do you have a sense that they are likely to keep with the agreement? And by the way, President Trump, of course, has criticized you, saying maybe you violated the Logan Act.
Well, I'm not. There's no negotiation. We didn't involve ourselves in negotiation the way Donald Trump did before he was even president and sworn in after the election, when they interfered in what we were doing in the Middle East, or the Senate when it sent a letter signed by 40 senators to the leader of another country to tell them not to negotiate with the people in the administration. So that people really need to be careful what they do and say here. Former Secretaries of State Colin Powell, Condi Rice, Henry Kissinger, George Shultz have frequently met with leaders and other people, and there is absolutely nothing in the United States Constitution that suggests we shouldn't have the right to do that.
But will the Iranians, you think, stay with the agreement for the time being as long as the Europeans do?
I can't tell you. I don't know. I mean, like anybody else, they're not going to, when I have a conversation with them, the conversation was a broad one that discussed, yes, the Iran deal. We discussed what their attitude might be, and they hadn't really figured it out at that point in time. But we also talked about Yemen, about Hezbollah, about missiles, and tried to see whether there was some way that Iran could change some of the things it's doing, which is in America's interest, in order to be put themselves in a better position with respect to other countries in the region, and try to defuse a crisis rather than grow it.
Mr. Secretary, let's turn to China, a major strategic issue for you while you were our Secretary of State. What do you make of President Trump's approach? Is there some credit to be given him that he certainly has engaged with them on trade? He's got their attention. There's no question about that.
Well, of course there's no question about that. And we need a new trade arrangement, and there are definitely serious issues with respect to China. Access to the marketplace, theft of technology and proprietary information, currency. I mean, we all know those issues, and yes, it is appropriate to try to do something about them. But I think the most important thing is to get China to focus on North Korea, which for a period of time was happening. And I give President Trump credit for trying to reach out and move that process and getting China to go further than they had on the sanctions. I think that's a very important part of being able to deal with North Korea.
Finally, I want to return to your book, if I may. You say specifically why you wrote the book. And you say, in part, you said it's not to relive a difficult past, but to remember how we changed the course of the country. Is the Democratic Party up to changing the course of the country right now? Because it seems to be fractured, doesn't seem to have a lot of leadership. Can the Democratic Party help do what you want to get done?
Well, I'm absolutely convinced it can and will. I think that it always looks a little fractured when the other party is in the White House and controls the House and the Senate. It's just the nature of the beast. And I think people are making too much about this notion of sort of fractured. I think the Democratic Party understands that every American ought to have health care, and that we shouldn't allow the Trump administration to try to destroy people's access to health care, and particularly prevent people with pre-existing conditions from being able to have it. I think the Democratic Party knows that we need to deal with climate change. We need to make sure our economy is fair. I think the party as a whole believes it is wrong to give billionaires huge tax cuts when average Americans are struggling to make ends meet. And so I think there will be enormous unity in our party for the fundamental values and principles that allow the American dream to take hold.
So through your book, you talk about some of the major initiatives you undertook, and with passion and vigor over a period of time, whether it's climate, whether it's Iran. I actually got the privilege to travel you a little bit in the Middle East, around Jerusalem and Jordan, saw how indefatigable you were on that. It must be very difficult to see a lot of those things come to naught at the moment, at least.
Well, it's difficult to see the President of the United States trying to move them backwards, put it that way. But I wouldn't say come to naught. And the reason is that in Iran, with the Iran deal, Iran, Russia, China, Britain, France, and Germany, 6 of the other 7 signatories, are all keeping the agreement and trying to move in a smart direction with respect to Paris climate change. Right here at our meeting on the Climate Action Summit, governors and mayors are all making it clear they are going to continue to move to try to meet the Paris standards, despite what has happened with respect to the president. So, the 38 states in America have renewable portfolio laws where they are going to move to sustainable energy production, sustainable environment policies. And those 38 states, David, equal 80% of the population of America. So Donald Trump may have pulled out of the Paris Agreement, but I got news for him and you and others. The American people are staying in the Paris Agreement, and they're going to do their best to try to meet the goals. And by the way, the goals of the Paris Agreement aren't enough to do what we need to do to protect the planet from the effects of climate change. We're heading towards 4 degrees centigrade rise in temperature on Earth in this century. That will be catastrophic. So we're way behind where we need to be, and the danger and damage, the reason Donald Trump's decision will cost lives, is there'll be more hurricanes, more fires, more damage to property. There's going to be more dislocation of people, refugees, and he is ignoring fundamental science, fundamental facts. And you can't make up your facts on this one.